let's get started. I'd like to welcome everyone to the session entitled Education Programming During COVID-19 Lockdown, Is Digital Sustainable? I'm Katherine Burton-Jones, the director of the Museum Studies program at the Harvard Extension School, and my pronouns are she and her. I live in Brighton, Massachusetts, a part of Boston, the traditional homelands of the Massachusetts and Nipmuc people. I offer my gratitude to the land itself and to the Massachusetts and Nipmuc people who have protected these lands and waterways past and present. I am a white woman with blonde and pink hair, and I wear purple glasses. I'm not using a virtual background today, and you can see some of my collection of flamingos. The speakers today are Kathryn Petterson, Research Assistant, Museum Studies Program, Harvard Extension School, Dr. Megan Ennes, Assistant Curator of Museum Education at the Florida Museum of Natural History in Gainesville, Florida, Grace Poole, User, Researcher Operations at Spellerberg Associates and /Culture Connect. So I'm going to turn it over to Kate now, and we'll get started. Thank you.
Thank you, Kathy. I'm going to share my screen. And can everyone see this? Yep, great. Okay, so those are the names of everyone Kathy just kindly introduced. And my name, as Kathy said, is Kate Petterson. My pronouns are she and her. I am a white woman with blonde hair wearing a navy blazer, and my virtual background today is a well-stocked bookshelf. I'm speaking to you today from Rhode Island, which is the traditional homelands of the Narragansett people. I offer my gratitude to the land itself and the Narragansett people who have protected these lands and waterways past and present. As the research assistant who works with Katherine Burton-Jones, I will be presenting our findings today. I'm also finishing up a master's degree in anthropology from the Harvard Extension School. So to get started, we all know that there was a vast shift in museum life that started in March of 2020. The American Alliance of Museums sent out a survey regarding the impact of COVID-19 on museums in June of 2020. And it highlighted that the majority of services museums provided during COVID closures or lockdowns were educational resources for children, parents, teachers, adults, and college students, along with live or recorded video lectures and other entertainment activities. In this same survey by AAM, we see that 64% of participants anticipated that they would have to cut back on education programming and other public services due to budget shortfalls and/or staff reductions. The takeaway here is that educational opportunities and resources were incredibly important when the pandemic began, yet it was precisely in this area that institutions anticipated making cuts. And this is where my work with Katherine Burton-Jones came in, as she wanted to better understand the interaction between COVID and the shift in museums and technology. So we conducted two national surveys, one from May to June of 2021, and the second from August to September of 2021. The survey questions centered around four themes: the customer or the visitor, so who were the museum's target audience, which programs were successful, etc. Museum strategy for digital engagement. So were programs monetized? Did they pursue community sponsors or partnerships? And in terms of technology, what platforms were being used for digital engagement and what technological restrictions existed? And finally, we looked at the organization and culture of the museum. So what types of staff were working on digital transformation and who was driving this process? The data we received from the surveys is far greater than we can go into detail to on this talk, but here we have the response demographics for the survey itself, for survey one. The first survey received 87 complete responses, and the majority of institutions who participated were small to mid-sized with 50 or fewer employees. Responses came mostly from art and history museums that were located in the Southeast and in New England. And our respondents were also predominantly director and management level employees. Now in survey two, we received 74 complete responses. And once again, history and art museums were the most common. In this case, the geographic areas represented were mostly New England and again, the mid-Atlantic. Now, the majority of responses, once more, were at the director or manager level. In our first survey, all but one institution offered virtual and digital programming during the initial lockdown. 58% of respondents monetized digital programming, but the majority charged only between $5 to $10 or suggested donation only. In our second survey, this past August and September, 39% of respondents said they were still going strong with their digital offerings, while 54% had reduced digital offerings and 7% had ceased digital offerings altogether. Now, only about 37% of respondents to survey 2 said that layoffs and furloughs absolutely affected them. And it is likely that the Paycheck Protection Program played a role in this. I know that as a museum educator myself during this period, this program was the reason I was able to keep my job. However, when asked about the greatest hurdle respondents faced for programming to return to pre-pandemic levels, almost 42% said reduced staff, and about 44% said decreased revenue and also health and safety concerns regarding COVID and the Delta variant. In our first survey, we asked respondents who drove digital transformation, and most responses indicated that it was driven by both staff members as well as the institution's initial pivot plan. Highlighting the important role that staff played in this rapid transformation, 62 respondents stated that their tech-savvy staff was one of the most important ways that they were ready to pivot online, alongside readily adaptable programming, digitized collections, and owning necessary equipment. Only 18 respondents said that they were completely unprepared for this quick shift. So staff capability and drive clearly played an important role in the success of the quick digital transformation during 2020. So in our second survey, we wanted to know whether the institution's experience with virtual and digital programming during the past year and a half had led to more support from senior leadership or the board of directors for future digital engagement. 31% of respondents strongly agreed that they now have more support from senior leadership for future digital engagement, while 32% somewhat agreed with this statement. However, when asked what areas still needed support from senior leadership for successful digital and virtual engagement, 26% of respondents said staffing, 25% said programming budget, and 23% said marketing and social media require further support. Only 4 museums felt fully supported for digital engagement, for future digital engagement, while only 1 institution said that they were not interested in pursuing digital further. So we have a bit of a mismatch here between the support that staff say they receive from senior leadership for future digital engagement and the areas that they say senior leadership still needs to provide support. And it is much like a mirror to AAM's June 2020 survey that showed all of the public programming and community services that museums provided, but then indicated that education and programming budget and staffing were likely to be cut. So really that leaves us with more questions than answers. What happened to the digital transformation momentum? How can programs be monetized? Why do staff say they feel supported by senior leadership and governance boards, yet require more staff and resources in order to make digital successful? Is digital truly sustainable for more than the most well-funded and well-staffed museums? And what are we losing if small to mid-sized museums cannot succeed in a digital environment? We look forward to discussing some of these questions with you in the campfire portion of our session. I'd like to thank you all for joining us today, and a big thank you for those who took the time to fill out our surveys. And now I will pass the baton along to Megan.
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today as we are sharing all of our information with you. As was already introduced, my name is Megan, and I am the Assistant Curator of Museum Education at the University of Florida. So that's the equivalent of an assistant professor position, and I do research on learning in and with museums. And I am a white woman with blonde hair and blue glasses, and I'm wearing a purple top, and my background today are the ferns located in our butterfly house at the museum. So today I'm going to be sharing with you results of 3 surveys that I conducted. The first that took place in February of 2020, so just prior to all of the museums closing. I was conducting research on how museums were engaging in online programming. Immediately following closures in March of last year, I sent the same survey around again to see how museums had pivoted immediately after closing. And then the third survey was shared again in March and April of this year. So I do believe I sent it through the MCN network. So if any of you participated in these surveys, I really do appreciate your time and energy. So our first survey, we had 74 participants take the survey. And again, this was prior to COVID closures. And these programs had been around for a long time, some of them almost more than 30 years. They were primarily run by education staff and by a small number of staff. So on average, only 2 people were running these programs, and they likely had degrees in either education or science. The majority of the staff who were running these programs said they received on-the-job training. So they shadowed someone and then facilitated the program themselves, as opposed to having a little more formal training. And prior to COVID, almost half of our museums were charging for their programs. Immediately following closing, we saw a shift in who was running the programs. Again, this is likely due to a loss of staff, particularly from our education departments. And at this point, almost a quarter of our museums said that their programs were being run by both the education department and the marketing department, and that this led to some interesting challenges as how programs are marketed online are a little bit different than how they're facilitated online. So it led to some conversations about what constituted best practices. And these programs were run by slightly larger groups of people, on average about 7 people, although we saw some that said all of their staff of 100 were involved in the programming. And at this point, only 7% of our museums were charging for their programs. 1 year following closures, we had 90 people take the survey, and 100% of our participants said they had closed at some point due to COVID, and that 78% of them were reopened at this point. And just over a third had had programs prior to COVID-19. We saw that it was mostly education programs again, that marketing departments were somewhat smaller. Average staff size was still a little bit larger at 6. And as we saw in all 3 surveys, people had either degrees in education or science. But we did see a major increase to 64% of our institutions charging for programs at this point. When asked about what kinds of technology they were using prior to COVID, it was primarily teleconferencing software, so Zoom. We saw a dip in that on the survey too, right after closure. And this was because a lot of museums said they didn't have access to things like Zoom in place. And so we saw a huge jump in who was using social media, such as Facebook Live, to offer their programs. So no one had been doing that on our survey prior to closures. And we're seeing still about 40% offering their programs through social media, but 1 year later, almost everyone had access to programs like Zoom. When we asked them what kinds of programs they were offering prior to COVID, it was 90% were doing school programs. We saw a major drop in that as schools and museums closed, but it's back up to almost 90% now. And immediately following COVID, we saw a big jump in the number of lectures being offered. So these were likely programs that were already planned to take place, but they shifted online. And as far as other programs, these were a lot of things like scouting programs. One of my favorite from survey 2 was virtual dance parties that were taking place. On survey 3, people were having Santa visits via Zoom. So all sorts of fun ideas were coming out of this. But we did see a jump back up to school groups and more teacher professional development at this point. And when we were asking who their audiences were, pretty much across the board, kindergarten through 5th grade was our major audience. And that's not surprising given who we normally see in our museums. And we saw a big jump in the public programs being offered on survey 2. So these were programs for the general family and people who didn't fall into groups such as schools. When thinking about what kinds of topics to do, it was mostly state standards, museum specific, or once museums closed, we saw an increase in people offering programs on based on their existing programs. So I have just a quick poll for you all. If you go to pollev.com/Megan Ennes 852, are these similar to the responses and the types of results that your museum saw, or is this different? And I will drop that link in there as well. So if you have a chance, go ahead and share whether this seems familiar. We should see some results pop up soon. I'll come back as everybody's thinking on that one, so we can stay on time. But the specific challenges we saw were a lack of staff, because a lot of people were furloughed and fired, a lack of resources, skills, and time, a lack of funding. There were new challenges when collaborating with other people, and whether to decide whether to charge for programs. Yes, the link won't work till I go back. Sorry about that. So I will, there, great. Somebody said it modeled what they were seeing. So a lot of our challenges are similar to the things we saw in our literature review that we had conducted prior to COVID-19. And I will share several links in the chat while Grace is doing her presentation about the kinds of resources that we have to offer as you're thinking about these programs. So thank you for your time, and I look forward to chatting further at the end.
Thanks, Megan. Hi, my name is Grace Poole. I'm a white woman with short brown hair and wearing a gray collared shirt. I am going to share my presentation. Okay. As I said, my name is Grace Poole. I conduct research with an independent museum consultation firm called Spellerberg Associates. For the past 8 months, we've been researching virtual events during COVID in the hopes of establishing a set of best practices and good tips and tricks for hosting successful virtual events. During MCN 2020, we researched how COVID and shelter-in-place initiatives affected museum website visitation. Unsurprisingly, we found by interviewing museums and analyzing their qualitative and quantitative data that the second most visited content on participating institution sites were those related to virtual event programming. Despite this data, we were still unsure how to classify a successful event and what elements museums needed to use in order for these events to become well attended. So we went back to our network and collected data from these 15 participating institutions of varying sizes and collection types across mostly the United States, but including some Canadian and also European institutions. We collected data from 2020 and 2021 in the hopes of figuring out what successful programming looked like. This first graph shows the total number of virtual events by institution. As you can see, the first three, History Colorado, Albright Knox, and the Hammer, were among those who did significantly more virtual programming during 2020 and 2021. But the average and a more common number of events was just over 100 or under 100 virtual events during the past 12 months. This is another graph that shows the total number of monthly virtual events by month. And we decided to cap it at 2020 and end it April 2020 and end it at April 2021 because in March virtual events were just ramping up. So you wouldn't see a ton of data there. And over the course of the end of the year, or the course of the end of right before the summer, you would see less and less events as the school year ramped down. So the highest number of events that we saw over the course of the year across all of the institutions were those relating to the academic school year. So May of 2020, we saw 208 events across all of the institutions. And then you saw that ramp back down in the summer when school wasn't in session, and ramp back up towards October to December. This graph shows the average attendance per event per month per year. And as you see, the April 2020, July 2020, and February 2021 showed the highest average number of attendees per event, averaging across all of the institutions. For 2020, particularly April 2020 and July 2020, this may be due to an increased interest and capacity for virtual programming for the general public, as well as for February 2021, an increased attention for online programming during more isolated months in the winter. This graph shows average number of attendees per day of week. And surprisingly to us, the average number of attendees didn't happen during the weekend, when you would think people would have more capacity and time to attend virtual events, but happened during the week. This is one particular chart that helped us point to perhaps the most successful events are those that are related to children, teens, or other educational attendee target audience groups. This is another breakdown of average number of attendees, but this time for time of day. So it starts at 8 a.m. and ends at 11 p.m. on this chart. As you can see, the most consistent number of attendees happens sometime during the school day or slightly after school, with a kind of outlier at around, I think that's 8 p.m. Not sure why that is, but I feel like the most important thing to focus on is the consistent numbers in the middle of the chart, that school day kind of graph from 12 to around 4. This is kind of the breakdown of what our participating institutions classified as their target audiences. And unsurprisingly, with the rest of the charts, you see that children and teens are the most well-attended averagely across all events in 2020 and 2021. This last chart I included because it, I think, points to another maybe best practice or element. So this includes average number of attendees by platform. I only include this to show that I think we all consider Zoom to be one of the kind of markers of virtual programming, the platform that most people use for virtual programming. But in our research, we saw that those institutions that allowed for multiple platforms, either streaming on Zoom and then including a recording somewhere else, or streaming live on Facebook and also streaming live on Instagram, allowed for more accessibility, more inclusivity, and it allowed for more participants per event averaged over the year. So lessons learned. While, and I'm sure that we all feel this, general public engagement in virtual events decreased over the pandemic, through this research and through the charts, you can see that students, children, and teens are those who continue to use virtual programming to both engage with content, but also engage with institutions more broadly. So some perhaps tips and tricks, although this is a study created in a vacuum, it's good maybe to focus on marketing and isolating your events to children, teens, and other educational programming, and perhaps set that sometime during the week, during the school year, particularly on Wednesdays, which we found were the most highly attended of virtual events. Another element, as I just mentioned, that should be important is maybe to stream and host events across many different platforms, platforms like YouTube or Zoom, but to do it across multiple platforms at the same time to increase accessibility and to promote inclusivity for your audiences. And that's it. So I'm going to hand it back over to Kathy, who is going to start our Jamboard.
Great, thank you. Megan, I'm going to ask you to share the Jamboard and introduce it to us so that we can all participate. We're so happy to have so many of you joining us today. And if we could take all voices, we would, but if you would raise your hand, I'll try to moderate that. And also please use the Jamboard so that we can record what your thoughts are, either comments or questions. Megan, go ahead.
All right. Hi, everybody. If you haven't had an opportunity to play on Jamboard yet, today is your lucky day. And I have dropped the link for that in the chat. And so when you get there, what you should be seeing is this lovely diagram going on. Perfect. Somebody's already jumping in there. Good work. If you would like to add a comment, just come over here, click on a sticky note. You can pick whatever color suits your fancy today, and then you can type something in there and move it around onto the Jamboard wherever you think it fits best. So what went well this year? What challenges are we still having? What questions do you have that are still burning in your mind? And then helpful resources. And again, those two links that are under the helpful resources are the ones I dropped in the chat already. So they're there just for you to work. But at that point, feel free to keep working on the Jamboard, but I think we also had some questions in the chat and have some opportunities to engage in conversation. So I'm going to, I think, quit sharing my screen for the Jamboard and we can just have some conversation.
Okay, it might also be useful to take like the last 3 minutes just to go back to Jamboard and see where we are. But who has the first question? And if no one raises their hand, we'll go to the chat. Okay, let's start with Elizabeth Peters' question about how do you account for engagement inflation that are seen in social media metrics, as in Facebook yields huge audience, but most drop off very quickly. Anyone want to jump in on that?
I think that was for Grace. It popped up during your conversation.
Cool, thank you.
Yeah, thanks. I will say that like during our data collection process, that was perhaps the hardest thing to analyze, just because Facebook is also notoriously hard to gather data from. So honestly, it's hard for me to answer your question, Elizabeth. I think it's something to keep in mind when building a virtual program, to know that that is a possibility, especially with Facebook. The other side of the coin is that Facebook Live is very accessible for a lot of people, and perhaps knowing that it yields a high audience but has a large drop-off it might be helpful when building a program to also include another platform to host it on at the same time, or to host a stream of that programming on Facebook Live after, and then host the real program, or not the real program, but the live program on something like Zoom later, if that answers your question.
Thank you, Grace. There's another question for you, but I think it's really for all of us. Will you be publishing your research somewhere, and when?
Yeah, I'll take it first. We're in the process of writing a blog post, which should be available on Marty's website, Spellerberg Associates, sometime after MCN ends. But I don't know if Kathy or Kate or Megan wants to answer this question as well.
We'll let Megan go next, and then Kate and I will chime in at the end for that publication.
So I have 2 publications available on the International Review of Open and Distributed Learning, which is, I think, the world's longest journal title ever. And I dropped those in the chat already. And the 3rd survey and the article that sort of summarizes what I put into the presentation today. So all 3 surveys and what we saw trend-wise in the field will be available next month from the Journal of Museum Education. And if you don't have access to that, please feel free to email me and I can send you a copy.
Great, thank you. So Kate and I do plan to publish. I don't know what the date will be. I have to be honest with you, I owe Lauren Vargas and Paul Marty something first, 2 projects individually, but we will get it done probably by the end of the year. And I don't know what publication vehicle we will choose. Kate, anything else on that?
I think you answered it.
Okay. Other questions for the speakers today? Grace, let's see, Stephen has a question. A lot of data showcased the broadcast details, day, week, month, attendees. Was there any data on what audiences most resonated with topics, types of activities?
For the purposes of this MCN presentation, we focus more on the quantitative numbers, but we are planning on perhaps adding a qualitative element to this research to include things like you mentioned, more qualitative either topics or types of activities that audiences resonated with. It is extremely hard to try to extract that information from qualitative data. And for the purposes of this MCN presentation, we want to focus more on the quantitative data now, but it is of interest to me, and I think the participating institutions, what their audiences resonate with.
Other questions, comments? We were hoping we would hear from you about successes or resources needed. Let's see, Rachel.
Hi. Sorry, I was just really struck, and I made a comment in the chat, but I think it was an interesting thread to follow through this, especially as you said, Grace, that you're like thinking about how to maybe do more qualitative follow-ups. Is that like how much the expectation of school programs as something that I think many of our institutions like routinely do and went virtual might skew the assumption of who is in those programs earlier in the day. You know, it's like, okay, so there was that huge spike in the evening and also some of the later in the day, you know, like happy hour type times. Like it would be interesting to know who, and this is, yes, a harder thing to gather data on, but it would be interesting to know, like, is it actually adult programs that is like where it's worth focusing a bunch of time and effort to continue digital if adults in the evenings are going to be more likely to come. But I know that's not something you can necessarily tell from all of these data, but just a comment and observation.
Great, thank you. Other comments, and thank you for posting in chat. We have another 10 minutes. Why don't we go back to the Jamboard, Megan, and see what we have there?
We have quite a lot going on, and I was looking at some questions people still had about, how do we think creatively about what's going on, and how do we move forward, and why should we move forward with digital? I thought that was a great question. And I'm not sure if everybody had seen these two reports from UNESCO. One was from last fall and the other is from this year. Just kind of discussing what museums did in terms of digital. And there are some questions that they raise, such as museums talk about how we use digital to really increase accessibility of our museums, but did we really do that? Or were we reaching our audiences that we already have access to? So that's one of the questions that still bubbles up for me, is how do we really reach new audiences in this new digital format? So
I think that's a great question, Megan, for all of us. We captured a lot of new people geographically and probably demographically during the main part of the lockdown and then after. And I wonder what our plans are to retain them. So any other comments in our last few minutes about what we see on the Jamboard? Kate?
I do have a follow-up comment to that. And as an educator who's presented virtually done programs, I know that people who have attended those programs have come from really all over the United States. And I think we have to remember that our local sort of constituents have networks that spread much more wider than the small community that a museum is located in. So personally, that's what I found. And I know in some of our responses to our surveys, it's the thing that museums really enjoyed and found so eye-opening about going digital, how much more people they were reaching in a different way.
Great, thank you. Other comments? Rachel, do you want to talk about that a little bit? Geographic expansion?
Oh, no, just that I think that was a really big finding. I mean, I'm not in one institution anymore, but we found exactly the same thing. And that was a lot of the comments that we got. And people who came back to our programs over and over again were not local and were only able to join because it was virtual.
Right. So I'm doing volunteer work for the Worcester Art Museum in Worcester, Mass. And the director was just really pleased to see how many of the people that he knew who had moved out of the area were now part of the community again, because they could come to the virtual programming. So they really enjoyed things like cocktails with the curator or the director. Of course, they got to mix their own. Let's see, is there anything else with chat that we'd like to bring out, or anyone want to raise their hand? I like the collaboration part that was mentioned. Thank you. Anything about the days of the week that Grace gave us? I really enjoyed that. I mean, I might have thought Wednesday, but I'm not sure. Now we have proof. So.
And
Okay.
I don't know if it is skewed a little bit by History Colorado, only because they hosted probably twice as many events as even the top person that submitted data. And over 75% of their entries for data were school programming, educational programming in particular. And a lot of those were hosted on Wednesdays. So that might point to why Wednesday had such a spike in our data. But The second highest number of events was from Albright Knox, and they have a particularly well-attended and well-loved program in the summer where people recreate works of art and then send in pictures. Pre-COVID, people came in those costumes to the museum, and we interviewed Albright Knox for our first study. And even before that program happened, they said that they had a spike in people coming to the website, being interested in the collection and figuring out a kind of artwork to be for that program. So that could also indicate that spike towards 8 p.m. Because they had thousands of people attend that event versus some other educational programming, which may have had closer to 100.
Great, thank you. I just want to call out Tim's comment about different time zones. I think that's really great. You know, it really opened up the whole world for us. So sharing programming in that way was really good, but it's not kind of big yet, but I want to go to that pink square called funding and ask any of the participants if you have seen any of the usual funders like IMLS and others directing funding toward virtual programming so that it can continue, or other funders that are local. Anyone have that experience?
I was talking with someone last week who said one of their local large companies paid for virtual summer camps on half days for school. And that way their employees could continue working and their children could attend these virtual camps. I thought that was really quite an interesting funding partnership, was to get a local organization to pay for private events.
That's great. Yeah, that's brilliant, actually. Any final comments from chat or otherwise? Let's see. No. So I would like to thank MCN for accepting our program and allowing us to invite another group, Megan and Grace, to be with us. I think there was a lot of synergy in that, and I'm grateful for your presentations too. So thank you all. We'll go ahead and end maybe 2 minutes early, and enjoy the rest of the Museum Computer Network.